Hi, I'm Anne Gaviola. Welcome to the Peak on Global, where we break down what is trending in the business world and what you need to know to stay ahead of the curve. Joining me now is Brett Chang from the Peak podcast. Welcome, Brett.
Hey, Anne, great to be with you.
So, Brett, there's news this week that Canada's household debt is greater than our GDP, and it is the highest among our G7 peers. How alarmed, if at all, are you about this?
Well, it's definitely a concerning stat, especially the top line number. It really does shock you. I think where this becomes a real issue is not when times are good, but rather when times are bad. So let's just kind of put this into context. If there is an economic downturn and people start to lose their jobs, they lose that income that they need to actually service that debt. So whether it's their house or it's their car, that becomes a real challenge for them. And that's when you start to see people defaulting on their assets, which nobody really wants to see and would be bad for the Canadian economy at large.
Yeah, it's that cascading or domino effect that a lot of people are worried about. Now, I interviewed a researcher at the CMHC this week who tells me there are some early signs of increasing financial distress among households right across the country. So more mortgages in arrears and an uptick in consumer defaults. This includes all kinds of things, including auto loans. How much of this is a reflection of a combination of rising interest rates and a high cost of living? Because even though interest has come off a little bit, we're dealing with both right now, and it is a squeeze.
Yeah, I think that there's a confluence of factors that are playing into this top line shocking number. You know, if you look at what the CMHC is saying and what the economists are saying, the number one thing that we can do to actually reduce this problem is to bring down the price of housing. That, for many people, is the number one debt line item that they take out. It's their mortgage. Now, if you can reduce the cost of housing, people are taking out lower mortgages, and that makes it more easily serviceable for them, and they'll have more flexibility in case that they do actually lose their job, that they'll still be able to keep their house with the savings that they've built up, or they'll be able to get a lower paying job to service that. So it's everything. It's cost of living, it's inflation, it's high interest rates, and that's all playing into this pretty shocking number that I think we need to really take a hard look at.
Yeah, it is everything, but it always comes back to housing. And there's a nice little segue here. I'd like to talk a bit about Canadian bank earnings. Now, we've heard from 4 of the 5 biggest banks. They miss profit expectations. Now, CIBC was the one outlier. There are some common threads, though. Canadian mortgage loan growth has really slowed to a trickle. And fears of bad loans have already shown up in the form of more money towards provisions for credit losses. The banks are warning of tougher economic days ahead. Nothing particularly shocking here, but interesting to see that it is showing up in the numbers.
It really does tie together. The number one thing that is hurting bank earnings right now is this need where they have to move cash that would be normally profit and issued in dividends to shareholders, but they have to move that into reserve funds so that in the worst case scenario, if people do start to lose their jobs and default on household debt, that they'll have sufficient capital available to them to make up for that difference. Now, that I think is precautionary, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen to the economy. And so on one hand, that's great to see, but it's a huge question that we're going to have to reckon with.
Yeah, and it is important to note that profit may have dipped, but our big banks remain profitable. In fact, they seem to be profitable kind of regardless of the economic climate, which is, I guess, a sign of prudent risk management. And it does make sense to put money aside during good times to have a cushion for tougher times. It reminds me of that fable. I think it's the ant and the grasshopper.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is very prudent. And if you look at the U.S. banking system, which we've been talking about a lot recently, you do have a variety of different financial institutions to choose from. You have countless regional banks that you can go to if you want.
4,000 plus choices in the U.S., I think, compared to Canada.
Yeah, that's a lot. You really only have 5 or 6 here, depending on how you count it. But really the one advantage to that system is that you have a tightly regulated system that ensures that these banks are acting prudently and responsibly, as you put it, to ensure that they have enough capital to make up for whatever crises might hit. And so that's, I think, generally good. Now, also, there are downsides to having that type of concentration in our banking system. I think one would ask that if the banks are always profitable, is there really any competition? I'm not sure about that. I think that probably you want to be safer than not with the banking system, and that's probably what we should move towards and lean against. But again, there's lots of discussion about Canadian banking recently, especially as we talk about oligopolies and monopolies in this country.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword, but we can agree it is much easier to keep an eye on, say, 5 or 6 things than 4,000 plus different things, right? Okay, our third topic is something that's been in the headlines. A Target in the U.S. was selling a Pride collection of more than 2,000 items. So this ranged from clothes to home furnishings. It pulled the collection after an anti-LGBTQ2S+ campaign, which included misleading posts on social media, intense in-person backlash from some customers that Target says included violent confrontations and threats against its own workers. Now, this story is super complex. It deserves more than the few minutes that we can devote here, but I would like to get your thoughts, Brett.
Well, look, I think you hate to see this happen, and it almost feels like there's a regression going on with some social issues, primarily in the U.S., and that's really disappointing to see. For a corporation, you have to make a tough call because on one hand, you have this small, vocal, activist group that is conducting this behavior, which is terrible. And at the same time, you're also trying to appease everyone else who kind of agrees that LGBTQ plus rights are really important, that we should support them and stand with that community. And they're trying to navigate these murky waters, and it's a very difficult balance for them to do. I think net out, this is an issue that has been settled. I think we all agree, or there's a strong consensus that LGBTQ plus rights are very important, whether it's in the United States or in Canada. And I wouldn't have taken this action, but Target's going to operate the way they're going to operate.
Yeah, it's a matter of human rights, in my view, and this story, it hurts my heart. I would invite people to find out more about what actually transpired because, social media is not the greatest source of news. This comes on the heels of the Cancel Bud Light campaign after Bud Light's parent company partnered very briefly with transgender influencer Dylan McFaney. I think there were some missed opportunities here for education, for transparency, fostering understanding by some big brands. But I do understand the desire to protect employees. I do think that's important. I think, this story is so much more than a business story because it's, as you mentioned, it's about societal progress, diversity, inclusion, all the rest of it, and so much more than dollars and cents, though I do think there was, a missed business opportunity in both cases as well.
At a macro level, I think the one thing that we need to remember is that corporations are motivated by one thing, and that's generating profit and value for shareholders. And in some cases, they do the right thing and they act appropriately. In other cases, they definitely do mistakes at the expense of our collective beliefs and values in search of that value for shareholders. And so that's something that we need to remember, that ultimately democratic institutions, the ones that we elect, are going to be the ones that we should lean on to ensure that stuff like this doesn't happen, and that corporations in the end are always going to be corporations. So it's something to keep in mind when you see events like this unfold.
Thank you so much for your time and insight as always, Brett. I appreciate that we can talk about, hard-hitting business stories and also ones that require a little more sensitivity.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anne.
And you can get all your daily business news with the Peak Daily podcast. It is available for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts.